Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest today is Professor Michael Marmor. He's an Emeritus Professor of Ophthalmology at Stanford. And we're going to talk about what he calls the artistic eye, how the eye interprets what we see and how that influences artists and viewers of art. So it should be a very interesting call. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Yeah, tell me, I guess it makes a logical connection, where you were into the eye and ophthalmology, and now you're looking at it with the artistic lens. But how did this change occur? What was your career and your study like, and how did it turn to artistry?
Well, it's kind of a long story. My parents were art collectors, primarily pop art in Los Angeles. So I grew up with art. I didn't study it formally, but it was a part of life, and I enjoyed it. And as I went on in medicine, I wanted to study the brain and how it works. And I was doing basic science, essentially the equivalent of a PhD at the NIH, but decided to go into ophthalmology because the retina in the eye is actually brain tissue. And so I could continue working on the brain and learning about how vision works and how it works within the eye.
What does that mean, the retina is brain tissue?
Well, embryologically, as the embryo begins to form a central nervous system, which means the brain, a little bulb starts to grow out the side of that neural tube, of that primitive tube, and it becomes the eye. It becomes the retina in the eye. So the nerve cells in the retina, which is in the back of the eye, like film in a camera, is actually composed of several layers of cells that are essentially brain tissue. And in many ways, we begin to think about what we see in our eye.
What does that mean, to think about what we see in our eyes?
What it means is that the retina has circuits that process and code and modify the visual information. One of the key things that many people don't understand is that the eye does not send a photograph up to the brain. A photograph may have thousands of pixels, whether it's a computer photograph or film, that send a complete image up to the brain. The eye has roughly 126 million photoreceptors, essentially pixels, little cells that pick up light. But there are only 1 million nerve fibers going up the optic nerve to the brain. That ain't going to work. We have to simplify that information and reduce the amount of information going up to the brain. And the retina does this in a number of ways. And the information that goes up to the brain about what we see is not a photograph. It's a complex combination of light and dark and outlines and colors relative to other colors. It's a very complex set of information. And that's actually what the brain sees. The brain doesn't see a photograph. And what artists, or all of us in a sense, have to work with is the fact that this coding, this simplification in the retina means that there are constraints about how we see things and about what art can do and about how we can see art.
So what happens when we're viewing something and the information goes to the brain? How is it organized, coded or decoded, compressed, uncompressed? What does it look like?
Sure. Well, the organization of the nerve cells in the retina are basically coding for contrast. what happens is that a few of the photoreceptor cells, those light-sensitive cells, more or less send information about light straight through to the optic nerve. But they're surrounded by a whole large number of cells that turn that circuitry off. And so what the retina is seeing is a bunch of donuts with excitation or light reception in the middle and inhibition surrounding it. If you just turn on a room light, the two offset themselves or offset each other, and it's not very exciting to the retina or the brain. But if there's an edge, a sharp edge between light and dark, that produces asymmetry across this light-dark donut. And boy, that just sets these circuits firing away. So the retina is built basically to recognize and to enhance contrast. And what we send to the brain is not a photograph, but more or less a cartoon of the light-dark outline of the things that we see. Color information is added, shading is added, the brain ultimately decodes all this. But it's a much simplified picture that's set up from the eye. And contrast is really at the core of how the eye sees the world, not only in black and white, but in color too.
Well, you ever see that? I'm sure you've seen the art picture. It looks like an old woman, but it also looks like a bird or something, depending on what you see. And
Right.
you look at it one way, all of a sudden you see the other. So what does that mean for art? I guess there's ways for art to be deliberately constructed like that picture where it fools the brain or what?
That picture doesn't have much to do with art. That's an optical illusion that depends upon what we're familiar with as people recognizing faces, ducks, vases, whatever complex you want, where you can look at it in two different ways. That's a brain function, not an eye function. And those kind of optical illusions are based on familiarity with certain shapes and things in our life. The retina
The principle should be similar, I would say. Because the brain doesn't have a complete picture, it's inferring, right?
Right, but I'm not talking about the brain. My field is the eye. And the eye, the input, is hardwired. The input simply sees what it sees, but it creates contrast. It's looking at the edges of things. The interpretation of what we see, or a face or facial recognition, is a brain function. That's obviously vastly important for art and for artists and for us looking at the world. But that's a different level of information that I'm talking about in this book or that my work is based upon.
All right. So you're saying the eye looks for contrast. So it looks for, does it look for contrast in color or does it look for contrast in black and white?
Actually, both. It's the circuitry, the way the cells are organized in the eye emphasizes the contrast between light and dark. It emphasizes edges, black-white contrast changes. And that's what gives us recognition of form and depth and the ability to say, I'm looking at a vase or I'm looking at you. Colors are more complicated. Colors evolved rather late in the evolutionary process. By that time, the circuitry in the retina, in our eye brain, so to speak, was already evolved and in place. And the way we see form and depth are totally colorblind because those circuits are already there and are based on light-dark contrast. Colors ended up using the same circuits and contrast, but those contrasts refer to color and not to form. The contrasts for us are blue versus yellow, more or less, which were the initial two colors that all mammals see, except the great apes that added a further pairing because their receptor, which was sensitive to the yellow end of the spectrum, split into sensitivity for red and green. And that gave the great apes three different colors that they could triangulate and they could see a full spectrum. And we evolved from the great apes and we can see a full spectrum of colors. So in sort of using figurative terms for these receptors, we contrast red versus green and blue versus yellow. We don't really see redness per se as a hue, but we see how red something is relative to the greenness of the world that surrounds it, and the same for blue versus yellow. So the colors are using the same contrast circuits, and the brain is sent information about the contrast between these different colors and somehow interprets that or figures out what that means in terms of a hue. That process is very poorly understood, and I can't really explain it to you. But we end up interpreting or seeing something as blue-green or orange, whatever it might be, but that's not the information that our retina, that our eye sends up to the brain.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Well, how is it interpreted then, or you don't know because that's outside of the eye?
Well, how the brain works is much less understood than how the eye works. It's a much larger organ with many different circuits that interact in different parts of the brain. So I can't answer that for you. But what I can say is that the fact that form, for example, is a colorblind function means that if you have colors, 2 different colors, say red and green, outlining a face or even letters, if they have the same brightness, you won't see the object because the form that we see is colorblind. It's based on the black and white system that was there long before colors even came into being. We have different cells that see colors in the retina, incidentally. They're so-called cone cells that have visual pigments that are sensitive to colors, and they came along late in evolution.
Okay. So how does this translate into how art is viewed and interpreted?
Well, these are the tools that artists have to work with. Artists have eyes, and viewers of art have eyes, but they can only see or work with the capabilities that the retina has, and this is what isn't always understood. Contrast, first of all, is a very powerful sense in art. If you look at paintings from the Dutch Renaissance, there are many great painters like Peter de Hooch who painted beautiful scenes, but they were all kind of evenly lit and looked very pretty. But most of us wouldn't call them great art. Now, Johannes Vermeer emphasized contrast. He used the bright light coming in through a window of a room, and there were dark shadows and contrast between the white shirt and the dark dress that somebody was wearing. And the paintings are very striking. They're exciting to us because they're high contrast. So that's one aspect of seeing, is that art does use contrast and depend upon contrast. Things that are low contrast are just sort of evenly gray or evenly colored, and most of those paintings don't have the same impact. But also, as I explained a little earlier, artists have to be aware of the fact that if they don't choose colors that have brightness differences, they will lose, or the viewer will lose, the recognition of the forms that the artist is trying to portray. Because you have to have brightness change to see things. Colors we can actually recognize, but we won't be able to recognize the shapes that are being outlined if the colors have the same brightness. I could show this better in a slide, but I can't talking about it, I'm afraid.
Right. So the more contrast in a painting, the more the brain will be attracted to that contrast?
To some degree, yes. Obviously, what we like, what we call exciting or beautiful, these are subjective things that are in the brain that relate to our history, our culture, the value we think something has to many different things. Art is not science, and I in no way want to claim that. What I'm trying to get across is simply the fact that there's more to art, more to what artists do than simply the aesthetics. The aesthetics are vital. Obviously, Rembrandt and Vermeer and Picasso had a sense of what they wanted to portray. And yet they have to work with the eye, and to the extent that they unconsciously, most likely, understand how vision works and what kind of lighting and contrast and coloring has certain effects upon the eye and upon the viewer, that makes them a great artist as opposed to maybe just a good artist.
Interesting. Do you see any artists play tricks with contrast, to change how the eye functions or to confuse it? Or, what have you seen, in art that really seems to, attract people's eyes or make them, influence them in a particular way?
Sure. And much of what makes great art exciting is the unconscious knowledge of the artists, the way that they can use colors and contrasts to, in a sense, to make their artistic point. But there's a genre of art, you're probably familiar with it, called op art, in which artists really use optical effects and optical illusions as a basis for their work. But what makes that art, as opposed to just a picture in a psychology book, is because the artist could take the image, which might fool the brain, but put it in colors in a framework to make it exciting to us as art. Art is not really dependent on what the image is per se. You can make art out of an optical illusion. You can make art out of a young woman named Lisa, but that doesn't make it the Mona Lisa. Leonardo did a lot more with that painting than simply making a photograph of a young lady. It's not known widely, for example, that Escher, whose prints are very well known, and many people will have seen two of his most famous prints, the Endless Waterfall and the Endless Staircase.
Yeah, I love MC Escher, yes.
Yeah, those two prints, which are, I think, art, we would all agree, were actually made after an optical illusion or two illusions that were published by some psychologist named Penrose. Escher saw the publication, sent the Penroses a letter saying, "These are interesting. Would you mind if I use them as a basis for some prints?" And they said, okay. And he did. What he did was not to present us with two optical illusions only, but he presented us with art.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So do you create your own art, knowing what you know about the eye, or just able to analyze it in a different way than other people?
Well, I wish I could create art, but I'm not very good at that. No, I'm not an artist myself. And my argument, as I say, is not that art is science or that by understanding the eye, you suddenly can understand art or be better at reading it or better at interpreting it. But by understanding vision, you have another set of information. You have other factors that you can use to enhance the way you see art, really to enhance your appreciation of art. And that's really what this book, The Artistic Eye, is all about. It's a book of 250 color illustrations of great art from all around the world. But it also shows how the eye works and how artists used those mechanisms of vision and those constraints of vision, and how some artists who did have visual problems, how their art might have been affected. And that's another whole interesting issue as to what kind of distortion in art means eye disease and what does not.
Okay. Is there any class of paintings or art that really, messes with people's perception, like those magic eye, designs that appear to go 3D and not?
Those are optical experiments, they're demonstrations. I don't consider those art. What I was referring to was the fact that many artists, in fact all artists, have that little freedom called artistic license to make art that goes beyond simply what they are looking at or what optical illusion might be there or what the scene or the portrait subject might actually look like. People here that I work with the eye and art, and that I am an eye doctor too, of course, and they say, oh, well, gee, so you must know that El Greco had astigmatism, and that's why he painted those long, thin subjects. Well, what do you think about that? Actually, it's nonsense. He did not have an astigmatic problem, and there are many arguments you can make to show that. He painted elongated figures, mostly heavenly figures, because that made the image more powerful to him as an artist. And when he wanted to, and particularly as a young man, he could paint perfectly realistic pictures. And if his distorted pictures, which he put on the canvas, were supposed to represent a real person, he would have seen the person as being doubly distorted. A painter always must put on the canvas exactly what he or she sees if they're trying to paint realistically. So there are many arguments. No, he was not astigmatic. That's nonsense. And a general principle is that if you look at odd colors or odd shapes or blur in a painting and try to judge that the painter had an eye disease, you will almost invariably be wrong because of artistic license. But if you know an artist had problems, and we know that Monet had dense cataracts late in his life, and we know that Edgar Degas had a retinal disease that diminished his vision over a span of 40 years, when we know how badly some of these artists were able to see, we can then see the effects in their art.
And what do you see, cataracts? Like from Monet, what jumps out at you, and corroborates the fact that he had cataract?
Well, you may not have seen most of his late paintings because he didn't sell most of them. There's a museum in Paris called the Musée Marmottan, or Musée Monet Marmottan now, which has most of the late paintings. He destroyed many of these. They're very rough, hardly able to see the images, bright oranges and dense and intense blues. They don't look like the Impressionist work that he's famous for, because by that time in 1922, his vision was failing badly. His cataracts were diagnosed in about 1912, and the aging cataract becomes gradually denser, darker, contrast becomes poorer, and vision becomes blurred, and color discrimination gets worse and worse and worse. Monet wrote that that reds are becoming muddy, that he couldn't see colors. He wrote that he began to choose his colors by looking at the names on the tube. Now, Monet was a guy who distinguished the color of his garden at noon and at 1 in the afternoon. Colors were vital to him. And
Yeah, that's terrible.
his whole modus operandi was being badly disrupted by these cataracts. He finally said, okay, I could hardly write. His handwriting got terrible. He said, okay, I'll have the operation. He didn't want to have it. He knew that Mary Cassatt did badly after cataract surgery, probably had complicated cataract. She was diabetic. And he thought it would probably damage the color vision to have the operation. He was right that it would change it because it made his color vision much better. But he finally had cataract surgery in 1923 and his vision got better. He returned to an Impressionist style of painting and finished the great water lily canvases that you see now in the Orangerie in Paris.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Many other artists have had unusual, visual or other problems that altered their art quite a bit.
Yeah, two are Edgar Degas and Georgia O'Keeffe. Both of them had a retinal problem. Edgar Degas may have had some inherited disease or inflammatory disease. We don't know because his vision got worse and worse over about 40 years. But late in his career, his vision was down below what we call legal blindness in the United States. And his pastels changed from being very precise and showing details of the face and the hands and the hair to being just sort of rough sketches. It was interesting that he kept drawing. His friends were saying, hang it up, old man, you just don't have it anymore. But he kept going because he was working mainly with the posture of women and dancers. And that was a large target. He could still explore these concepts, even if he didn't see very clearly. But his late pastels are very rough and very coarse, no details, and don't look anything like the work that he did as a younger man, even though he continued to do pastels until only a year or so before he died because his studio in Paris was taken over during the remodeling of the city. Other artists is Georgia O'Keeffe. She had age-related macular degeneration, which is one of the more common and serious problems of age, even in our modern times. And she lost vision somewhat suddenly over a couple of years' time, and it had bleeding into the center of her eye and some laser treatments that didn't really help her. And she was struggling because if you look at the work that Georgia O'Keeffe did as a younger painter, the wonderful outdoor scenes and mountains and the pictures of flowers and bones were all extraordinarily delicate in their shading. That was at the heart of what she did, was contrast, being able to show the delicate shading of natural objects. And as that capability faded with her eye disease, she began to paint hard-edged objects that didn't have the shading and the delicacy. She recognized she wasn't doing so well. She hired a young man named John Poling to help her paint and instructed him on how to hold a brush and how to make shading and do things with your work. Painting's quite a complex skill, actually. And at one point, one of her paintings was published in a local newspaper, and Poling told the editor, I should really get credit as a collaborator on this painting. And Georgia O'Keeffe was livid. She said, basically, he's nothing but a palette knife. And she had made some sculpture earlier in her career. Should we be crediting the foundry as an artist? But she was stung. And shortly thereafter, she gave up painting altogether.
Wow, that's terrible. So what do you I understand these stories are interesting, but are they being used to help artists of today? Or is that not really the goal? It's just interesting to understand what they went through and how it shaped their art masters of old.
Well, you could look at it both ways. I think artists that understand vision and perhaps would read some of this will get some hints and some clues at how art does affect the viewer, and that might be useful to them. But my book and the things that I do, this isn't a manual for artists. It's simply a way of looking at art and of understanding vision. It's also how you see the world, not just artists. And it helps you to understand how your eyes work and why you see things in certain ways. Here's another example. Why is it that you can see the same person indoors with the lights pretty much out and outdoors in the bright sun? There's about 1,000,000-fold difference in physical terms in the brightness outdoors as in dim indoors. And yet you're still able to recognize the same person. That's because of what we call constancy. Because your retina, not the brain, the retina in the eye shifts its sensitivity along a brightness scale very quickly within seconds to readjust so it can make the same light to dark comparisons in your face or colors between the brightness outdoors and the dimness indoors. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to recognize the same person in two ways. Or if you went through a tunnel on a bright sunny day, you're driving along and the inside of the tunnel looks pitch black. But thank heavens, as soon as you get into it, your retina shifts its sensitivity to a new level and you're able to see in the lights within the tunnel so you don't go smashing into the wall. That kind of adjustment is very useful. Well, whenever it's bright outdoors, something like the inside of a tunnel or a dark painting on a wall looks very dark and it's hard to see. And a trick you can use in museums, where most museums, are white walls and bright lights. And if you look at a painting, a dark painting, some of Rembrandt's, some of the Dutch Renaissance, some of the indoor scenes are very dark paintings, particularly the varnish has gotten old too. Take a piece of paper and roll it up into a tube, or just hold your hand into a tube and look through that tube at the painting. It will suddenly brighten up because you're cutting out the bright lights that are telling your eye it's bright outside, and you can see the details in the painting much, much better. Just a little.
Oh, okay. It's like, or I guess maybe you could turn down the lights in the room that you're in if you were able to get to them in a museum. And would you see them very differently?
Yeah, I think if you did that in a museum, they'd handcuff you and take you out.
I understand. Has anyone done an exhibit like this where they have their same reprints but in different lighting conditions to see how it changes the picture?
Not exactly that, but some museums have experimented with darker walls instead of using the bright white walls, so that paintings that aren't so bright can be seen much, much better because the overall brightness of the room is much less.
Okay. Well, very good, Michael. We're just about out of time. Where can people get to see your writings and,
Sure.
see your thoughts and everything? Keep tabs.
Okay. Well, thank you. I've been teaching and writing about vision and art now for many decades, and not only as an ophthalmologist, taking care of retina patients at Stanford, but also for undergraduates, where I taught an undergraduate course about the art of an eye for many years. My recent book, which is called The Artistic Eye, is actually my third book on this subject of art in the eye. And it just came out last year. It was published by Kugler, and it is available through bookstores, through Amazon. It's a book about, as I say, with about 250 illustrations of great art, and also a discussion of how the eye works, and not try to claim that art is science. Art is a wonderful aesthetic enterprise and a cultural enterprise that has many reasons to be seen and observed and liked or disliked in our society, but to give you one more tool to look at the world and to look at art and to realize what artists have to work with when they make great art.
Excellent. Well, very good, Mike. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.